Late 80s, it became pretty important for me to focus on some of those qualities of paint that seem to generate optical paradox in a way that both contained an appreciation of flatness, of the blur, and of the atmosphere that gets created with that. When I'm thinking of a very simple, I'll show you one. So this is a work that comes out of the late 80s, early 90s. And it's got a very simple structure, slightly dynamic, that it's not about straight planes. It's not about just the geometry, it's about the organic sort of shifting that operates both laterally.
Yep.
And the way that that operates as a flat surface, as a physical thing. But optically, it operates as an atmosphere as well. So you get this fusion and a double thing. So in some ways it was attempting to go back to the quite an essentialist thing of how to make a contemplative painting about light and dark, illusion and flatness.
The interesting thing, one of the interesting things is that the gesture is still there in that painting, like the mark making. It's not a technically produced blur. I mean, mechanically produced blur. Yeah. It's evidence. It's evidently handmade.
Yeah, definitely. And again, you remember this is in the 80s, and computers weren't being widely used even.
Yeah, I guess that's right, actually, isn't it?
It's only in the mid 80s onwards that we started at art school using computers, and they were cumbersome things. They were quite wacky. And
yeah, I remember in the 80s it seemed amazing until it was a photo on a computer.
Yeah. And so those sorts of I guess principles in the work had an effect. It's not just the effects that I was interested in, but why was I using these effects? And I guess that sometimes hasn't really been, discussed. I mean, this came out of, as I said to you earlier, it came out of an interest in perceptual observation and analysis of how I would describe three-dimensionality, or how I would describe my movement of vision when I'm analysing something realistically.
So actually, illusion and representation is still very much there in the work.
I think in every artwork it's there.
Yeah.
And the reasons for it are still to create. They're not that different these days, although perhaps some of the forms look different. Are to create a contemplative space for thinking about how we construct meaning and how we negotiate meaning through an artwork in relationship to being in the world. So those things, like how colour started to function, when you start to mix those two things, like I looked for the, obviously I did white and black. I think I did grey paintings for about 3 years, and they were losing one element of the chromatic. So I started to bring back in what I could see as the colour at the time in the paints that were available for me. What was the most optical or light colour that I could use? And in this particular flash paint, and in the Lafranc and Bourgeois paint that I'd been using at the time, it was called Imitation Japanese Lemon Yellow.
Nice.
So those things started to bring...
How is the supply of imitation Japanese lemons holding up?
Well, it's sort of, I don't use it so much anymore. But it therefore created a lightness, both in terms of the weight of a colour, and it also brought back something that I think I've started to take on board, and that is that painting is an application of colour. It's not just embodied colour as plastic is or something like that. It's an actual surface coating.
Mm-hmm.
And so the surface coating has, by its very nature, an implication of time and the manner in which it's made over time.
You mean that the surface exists prior to the colour being applied to it?
Usually, yeah.
Yeah, and then there's that element of
the
work
time
of
of
actually
making,
going on. Yeah, and presumably the surface slowly disappearing under that presumably very thin layer of paint.
Yeah, yeah. Some of the recent works at Nellie's, like the movement of grey with a pigeon, when you first look at it, it looks quite as if there isn't a gesture there. But if you get in the right angle, then you will see that gesture of mark and how that signifies a particular time in relationship to photographic time, or a particular quality of greyness in relationship to photographic greyness. So there's these sorts of questions about the differences of light, and colour and layers of time are quite important, because they deal, I suppose, with that issue of that we live amid a complex time.
When you say we live amid a range of complex times, are you talking about the way that we perceive times? Like sometimes time goes fast, sometimes it goes slow. There's some kind of universal time, and if you think about it on a physics level, there's not really any kind of one single speed of time. It's different depending on where you are. That's kind of what you're. Yeah.
Well, the show, for example, in Germany, that was I worked with a German artist, Christoph Dahlhausen, and it was called Light, Glass and Transparency in 2007. And it operated, the whole purpose of that show at the Kunsthalle Dominikaner Kirche in Osnabrück, big word, was in a 13th century Gothic building, an old chapel. And the cloisters had been made into newer galleries, and that's where Van Fleven and all those other super artists were involved with. But Christoph and I worked in the old church part, and the whole purpose of that was to help construct an experience of this multiplicity of times that we exist amid, and that we can become conscious of. So there was the painted surfaces that we used. There was the distribution of form through space. There was a sonic component. There was lighting that was either fluoro lighting that was stepped and timed, or there was this material called illuminate that we had pulsing up a central pole that went at the speed of the Earth's rotation. There was another plinth that contained a slow breathing signifier, the speed of change of just a slow breath. There was a static light component. And all of that within a Gothic church that's both a historical time but situated amid a nature, because you can see that changing of daylight and the seasons, if you're there for long enough, within these sorts of structures.
Yeah, and it's a nice analogy, because not only are those churches built over more than one lifetime, but even within them, the intervals and measurements aren't consistent. They change all over the place. Yeah.
Well, this one, that east-west, north-south axis that traditional Gothic buildings have, this was off because it was built into the city wall. So we reoriented by wall painting the original axis of the ideal. And so, again, when you line up plinths and you did other things within the space, it was about trying to, both in terms of our own experience and provide an opportunity for thinking about these movements through time and space, and through the experiences of what the artwork can provide in helping to consider this complexity, which includes the politics, the history, all the other stuff.
Yeah.
Even though it looks dumbly simple as a formal colour. And so that the colours that were used in that actually came out of a painting like this. When you mix that yellow and that black, you tend to get these greens.
Yes.
And so over the years, I've just heightened those greens.
Oh, that's where the green comes from.
Yeah.
Okay.
And there's a range of other things. You know, we won't talk about the symbolic layers of colour in one sense. We might, but they're so culturally specific. But there's also an experience of colour without having to go into the symbolic order of it. That when you look at that yellow, it gives you a certain lightness and movement that's quite different from, I don't know, what other yellow. One of these yellows that are slightly warmer.
Yeah. Well, I think, and even the surface it's painted on changes the character of it.
Exactly, yeah. And I think they're the sort of things that, by becoming attentive to how we experience that, the artwork has got a particular type of function.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was listening the other day to someone talking about the Mary thought experiment, is it? And the philosopher is Paul Jackson, is it? I think, Australian philosopher. Anyway, this the thought experiment is Mary knows all about the is a brain specialist and knows all about the mechanics of optics and exactly how it works and how colours are received and rods and cones and wavelengths and everything, but has never actually seen colour. Somehow she lives in a completely black and white world. So what does she actually understand about colour until she goes and experiences it in a real sense? What is that experience like? What is that actual thing? You can't quite quantify it. It's not really knowledge. She actually already really has the knowledge. It's the experience. It's something slightly different.
Yeah. And our negotiation of the world is all of those things. It's not an either or. For most of us, you know, it might be for individual people that have got some heightened ability or lack of ability, but usually our negotiation, our negotiation is really between knowledge and experience, you know, and then the association and then intention. You know, are those things that will, you know, create our awareness, I suppose. And that's one of the things I find about the language of painting that's still really valid today, because it can heighten that ability for us to pay attention to objects in the world that are made for that purpose.